it's actually mediated by this molecule. So what we did next was to use a construct having the only central NBD domain, and what we observe over here, that the effect is back. We observe that central NBD domain to a great extent retains or repeats this suppressive effect on interleukin 6 mediated STAT3 activation as seen in the wild type molecule. But one doubt still remained over here, though these studies are effectively controlled using the empty vector as such, where you are filling up with this empty vector and making the total DNA concentration constant to 100 nanograms under each experimental individual setup, but still to rule out any possibilities of an artifact just because of the overexpression, we use a construct known as the K200R mutant of this molecule, which has a single point mutation in the NBD domain, which essentially abolishes its oligomerization and autoactivation properties as defined in the classical literature. For example, this mutant abolishes its capacity to activate caspase 9, and what we observe over here is we lose the suppressive effects completely. So in a nutshell, what we conclude over here is that NOD1 specifically suppresses interleukin 6 mediated STAT3 activation, and these suppressive effects are somehow mediated by the central NBD domain as such. But in spite of these observations, one question still arises, that maybe somehow upon using these individual constructs, as we saw lastly, is that probably in a very sense that these individual constructs might not be viable equally to bring out or to show any particular effects as such. So to address this question, we have to go back into literature, and we planned to repeat the classical experiments related to these constructs, which were governed by the basal NF-kappa B activation, and this brought us to the next level, or the other side of my PhD thesis, or the second part of my PhD thesis, as we will say, that the effect of NOD1 on differential NF-kappa B activation. So in the literature, it is defined that NOD1 enhances NF-kappa B activation, the basal NF-kappa B activation as such, and we also observe that NOD1 wild type enhances basal NF-kappa B activation. It is also defined that this loose-enriched repeat domain, the ligand recognition domain, makes inhibitory loop in the native state, which restricts such an initiation of inflammatory response, so that there is no autoactivation as such to some extent, and deletion of this particular domain leads to an enhanced NF-kappa B activation. So do we observe such an effect in our studies? Yes, we do. When you delete the basal, this loose-enriched repeat domain, you see an enhanced NF-kappa B activation, and it was further defined that this caspase recruitment domain, this effector domain, is primarily responsible for the elucidation of the NF-kappa B activation. So, in a sense, if you delete the card domain, you would essentially lose the NF-kappa B activation as such. So, do we observe this in our studies? Yes, we do. Deletion of the effector domain, it is completely dead. There is no effect, there is no enhancement of the NF-kappa B activation. Further, when you use these individual domains as such, which was primarily designed to address the equal viability of these constructs, if you upon using the only LRR domain, there is total loss of the basal NF kappa B activation, which is same as using the only NBD domain. Again, if you remember, the central NBD domain alone was sufficient to bring out the inhibitory effects on interleukin 6 mediated STAT3 activation, but in here this is completely there. But when you compare this with the only cargo domain here, you see a very slight, a very minor, but still increase of the basal NF kappa B activation as such, and this addresses the last problem or the last doubt that these constructs are equally viable, they are functional as defined in the old literature as such, and our effects or domain specific effects on the inhibition or suppression of interleukin 6 activities is quite genuine, and it is primarily based on a central NBD domain, which is also further handled using the point mutant, which of course showed zero activation of the NF kappa B. But as we said, while addressing this question, we jumped to the second part of my doctoral thesis, which was differential expression of the NF kappa B activation. So when we observe these effects on the basal NF kappa B activation, the idea came that would there be any difference or effects of these domains somehow, as like the interleukin 6 setup, also on the NF kappa B setup. So what we try to study is inducer mediated NF kappa B activation, and interestingly, very interestingly, we observe over here that while that node 1 enhances the basal NF kappa B activation as you just saw, but simultaneously brings down the TNF alpha mediated NF kappa B activation. You see over here that the leucine rich repeat domain being deleted enhances quite strongly the basal NF kappa B activation, but also slightly brings down the TNF alpha mediated NF kappa B activation, and the deletion of the effector domain essentially abolishes the basal NF kappa B activation, but also strongly inhibits the TNF alpha mediated NF kappa B activation as such. And upon using the individual domains as such in the construct having the central NBD domain, though not as strong as the previous two constructs, but we still see a very minor drop of the TNF alpha induced NF kappa B activation as such. But these constructs having the only LRR or the only card domain are essentially dead, and so is the point mutated construct in both the cases. So this has brought us to a stage where we would ponder over the concept that in spite of enhancing the NF kappa B mediated inflammatory immune response, this particular molecule could well be playing a homeostatic role as far as the inflammatory reaction is concerned. So in a way, it enhances inflammation by NF kappa B, but simultaneously it checks the inflammation to go overboard by bringing out such inhibitory effects which are mediated by a particular inducer as such. But these are the questions which would be addressed in our group in the time to come. So coming back to my original project, we observe clearly so far that node 1 suppresses interleukin 6 mediated STAT3 activation as such, and at this point of time, believing on our observations strong